later on, if I'd like to ask about a specific topic, if the speakers would like to chime in on it. But until then, please feel free to just discuss what you feel is relevant.
Yes. Yeah, I would like to ask Dr. Juarrero, the very nice talk. Thank you very much for attending and presenting that for us.
Thank you.
But I'm thinking in terms of some very simple system, let's say the trajectory of a planet
Yes.
in the sky. Now, science has looked at that, observed the different positions of planets in the sky, and they've come up with laws of that trajectory. Now, that law would be what I would consider a constraint. If that's correct in your point of view, be a constraint of the system of the movement of of that planet. Now, it seems to me, though, what you're saying is that the laws are created by the trajectories somehow, and this is where I'm having a difficulty understanding that conception. Where do these constraints come from? Like a law of a moving object. It can't come from the object itself, as far as I understand.
I'm very glad you brought up the whole point about planets, because of course even Newton realized that his laws of motion did not work as soon as you brought in a third planet. That as soon as you brought in what I would call context changes everything. And he realized that his predictability did not work. So I would call what we call a law a description of that constraint regime as it is operating. And I would want to say that probably the resonance among atoms, so I want to call constraints conditions that are not efficient causes. For example, even physicists have known for a long time that if you stand a whole bunch of metronomes on a platform, they will all end up swinging together, correct? That is called by physicists a governing constraint, as if the whole interconnectivity through the sharing of the vibrations creates a dynamic that is different from the individual components. So, but the shelf does not impart additional energy to those individual metronomes. The shelf is the enabling constraint that allows this higher level organization to emerge and create. And I would want to say that's true going all the way up and down. Does that help? Like the shelf on which the metronomes are placed, for example.
Well,
go ahead.
Yes, but that doesn't address the point that I'm asking. Where does that, let's say in a trajectory of a planet, where does that constraint come from? Can you explain that?
It's interesting because apparently now they are discovering certain lines of I don't want to say lines of force, but they're also like skeleton, almost like a scaffolding in the universe that might be that in the book I speculate that might be an example of a context independent constraint in the universe that might be responsible for example, the coalescence of cosmic dust into the galactic formations and so on. So I think I don't have a direct answer to your question, but I think what I'm hoping to do is to try to point to what we should be looking for. We should be looking for constraints. We should not looking for efficient causes.
Okay, and the other thing is that Aristotle gave, as you mentioned, 4 causes, and I recognize them as a concept. There's a formal cause. The efficient cause would be the agent who's acting. The material cause, of course, is the materials it's made of, and the final cause or purpose. That's for the sake of which it exists. You're only sticking to the efficient cause. This seems to be the paramount conception of the modern scientific viewpoint, which eliminates the other points of view.
Well, that's what I'm arguing against. I'm arguing against sticking only to efficient causality. But I don't want to go back to an Aristotelian understanding of final cause, which was built in from creation, universal, unchanging, doesn't matter what context it is in. The acorn, in Aristotle's view, is going to turn into an oak. We know from epigenetics today that very often the acorn, I'm following the metaphor here, the context in which something develops changes the phenotype dramatically. And so I don't want to stick to a notion of final cause that is built in by the creator from the start. I don't want to stick to a formal cause that is an idealist, almost Platonic concept. I understand Aristotle was not a Platonist. That's why he got kicked out of the academy. But he believed that the form was always embodied. But that form also pre-exists the substance in logic, if not in existence. And what I would like to say is that enabling constraints allow nature to be really creative, to generate novel types that aren't just being embodied and already were pre-existing, that they really are novel creations of the universe. I'm sticking my head up. That's pure speculative metaphysics.
Yeah, well, no, I'm just thinking very carefully about these things. Form and matter, yes, are related, no, without doubt. And for you, the constraints seem to be the form of the content.
I don't think these enabling constraints are the form. I think once those enabling constraints close, and I strongly recommend a book by Moreno and Mocio that came out about 7 or 8 years ago. I think it is Springer, called Biological Evolution, where they talk about the closure of constraints. It's not just the closure of processes, like the closure of the water cycle of the processes. It's the closure of the constraints, where the constraints themselves regenerate themselves to keep themselves going. And they consider that the hallmark of the origin of life and autonomy and agency. And that's where the independence of life comes from. So I strongly recommend their understanding of constraint, because I borrowed quite a bit from that.
All right, thank you.
I have a question for Dr. Turner.
Okay.
Would you limit the notion of interfaces? That's also true for Dr. Ravinath. But would you restrict the notion of interfaces to membranes, for example, in the case of biology? I'm thinking in terms of liquid-liquid phase separations, for example. I think those provide boundaries and do more or less the same functions that the membrane does.
Yeah, I would agree with you completely. I mean, the cell membrane is just the very simplest and most familiar example of an adaptive, or what I'm calling adaptive interfaces. But then we get up to examples like the termite mound. The termite mound is an adaptive interface. Its internal structure is basically controlled by the termites themselves, and interacts with the wind environment in such a way to make the termite mound behave as a lung, and you can extend this even further, and you can look at the modifications of environments by collections of organisms, not just superorganisms, but also entire ecosystems as adaptive interfaces, because what you're really doing here is you're using information to constrain, if you will, the movement of matter and energy between organisms, environment, and other environments, and that could very easily act as an adaptive interface in my view. So yes, I would not limit it to a membrane.
And I think what you end up with is that, and this fits with Dr. Noble's notion about freedom increasing at the higher level, is that those constraint regimes over eons, over evolutionary time, over cosmic time, are increasingly loose. They are generative in that they support many instantiations of the same dynamic. So they have become looser over evolutionary time, I would suggest. And that is what allows the incredible richness that can evolve as a result.
So are the constraints looser, or is it just that life over time has been able to mobilize much more energy to basically organize it itself? And I mentioned the 90 terawatts of energy that was captured in the Earth's energy budget. I don't know of any figures that have looked back in the past to see what the energy budget or what the diversion of energy into life was back, in the Precambrian or the Archean period. But the increasing of life's complexity, Mary and others have pointed to these life's major evolutionary transitions. That has to be accompanied by a variation in the ability, basically by an increase in the ability of life to mobilize energy towards its ends. And I don't know if anyone has any familiarity with these kinds of paleo energy budgets that we're talking about.
I don't know about that,
The
but we
critical
know
one.
that
The
adult brain uses less energy than the infant. So the organization of the brain through learning is it lowers the rate of local entropy production overall. Now, as an adult, we consume a lot more energy, but a lot of it is just going to the work to keeping that lower entropy structure going. Sorry, Dr. Noble, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yes, if I could come in on that question, it seems to me that before the symbiogenetic event that led to the formation of mitochondria, chloroplasts, plastids, or whatever you want to call them, there would have been no possibility of multicellularity, because the amount of energy you can get prior to that symbiogenetic effect was only about 10% of what is necessary. So that transition, which is certainly one of the transitions, of course, that John Maynard Smith and Mari include in their lovely book, that transition was absolutely critical to the whole of what we call the Cambrian period of explosion. It would not have been possible for energy sufficient to keep, for example, a heart beating to pulse blood around a multicellular organism. These are simple physiological facts. So I regard McClintock's work, although she always generously said it was not her discovery, but she certainly put it on the map. It was otherwise left to some papers published at the very beginning of the last century that had not been paid much attention to at all. She put the whole issue on the map and argued for it. I chaired a debate between her and Richard Dawkins here in Oxford in 2009. But it seems to me that that was the critical transition that made it possible for multicellularity to occur. Without that, it would not have happened.
And I've often said that the real triggering event in the development of multicellular animals certainly was the invention of the epithelium, and I mentioned the epithelium as the next scale up of the extended organism, and energetically that makes a certain amount of sense. You know, if you have homeostasis that's being imposed on both sides of the adaptive interface, the fact is there's the disruptive forces to that orderliness are much greater if it's not encapsulated, and this is probably one of the big motivations for inventing the epithelium. It's just easier for the cells to maintain a nice regulated environment for themselves if they hide it behind another adaptive interface, namely the epithelium, which actually controls the environment on its own on the inside of that. And if you look at the expansion of capabilities that organisms were capable of, the epithelium is one of the fundamental organizing principles of multicellular animals. You know, almost everything can be reduced to some kind of epithelium or whatever is the epithelium is nested within. And there is some evidence that this kind of organization actually does save energy. It's an energy conservation means. Not only is less work needed to maintain homeostasis, but it's a different order of magnitude of conservation of energy, and this is evident in if you look at the scaling with body size of metabolic rate, which is the energy consumption rate. You know, if it doesn't behave according to the ways that you would expect from simple geometric scaling, you know, certainly in the case of animals, the variation with body size is different from the variation that you get in a collection of organisms like bees of the same biomass. It's the scaling is entirely different, and that feeds into basically metabolic efficiencies of inherent in the multicellular organization of animals. So
yes, I have to say that no, please, after you.
Dr. Ravinath, I believe Brian Ford is suggesting you go ahead.
Yeah, so basically I wanted to, I'm talking about a totally different aspect. I would like to quote the famous scientist Albert Einstein, who has said that science without religion is lame and religion without science is blind. And I, with my scientific background, which I had already acquired through my academic, and then I switched over to spirituality. I got deeply interested in meditation because of various profound experiences. And I also started reading Srimad Bhagavatam. Sri Krishna Keshava Das ji conducts regular sessions of Srimad Bhagavatam every alternate days. And I found a lot of scientific insights in the Vedic scriptures, which I have quoted for quite a few times in my talk today, from the Bhagavad Gita, from the Srimad Bhagavatam, from the Prashna Upanishad. So the Vedic approach is basically to go inward. There is a highly sophisticated laboratory inside each and every one of us, and that is our mind. Our mind is a very powerful tool which can be harnessed to help us to overcome all kinds of problems in our life. It could be physical, it could be mental, it could be emotional. So my approach has been always to go inward and seek answers. And I would like to quote from the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, which is a very ancient scripture, where he says that Pratyakshanumana Gamana Pramanani, where he says that knowledge which gets revealed to you is much more powerful than the knowledge which you get reading books or any other means. So, however, when the knowledge was revealed to me, various revelations happened to me. I kept journaling them, and it took me several years to make up my mind and to put them together in the form of a book. And so I used a lot of scientific work which has been already done to substantiate the messages that I received. So I thought I should clarify this point, because consciousness is something which you will be able to experience it when you transcend your physical form. Like, we all have this gross body and the energy body. So during deep states of meditation, when the mind is held in a non-thought state, it literally goes into a state where you get no thought, and that is the state a lot of revelations happen. And all the points which I shared today in my presentations were revelations which happened at various instances, and I have substantiated them with the relevant experiments done by various people in different parts of the world. So I thought I'll share that with you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the religious idea, or the idea of religion, is different from the modern scientific viewpoint, in that the modern scientific viewpoint is materialistic. It basically
Yes.
says that the universe is the whole. We live in a universe of matter. Whereas the religion takes the viewpoint that we live in God, a sentient being, a conscious, self-conscious, what would you say, self-conscious personality. We live and have our being within that. So how to accommodate the difference, between
Yes.
the scientific point of view and the religious point of view.
Yeah. In fact,
If
the
they-
point which you covered in your talk, I'm sorry to interrupt. The point you covered in your talk about anabolism, metabolism, and catabolism, the creation, the sustenance, and the destruction, is
Yes.
covered in Srimad Bhagavatam. So the religious texts also believe that the consciousness is constantly evolving, depending upon the needs of man. The cosmic consciousness is also constantly evolving. And if there were a kind of gadget to measure the type, the nature of consciousness, the cosmic consciousness is exactly same like our individual consciousness. But the reason we all differ, we all are individualistic, is because our individual consciousness is associated with a mind which is unique to each and every one of us. And that mind is unique because we all have different types of memories and experiences and impressions embedded in it, depending upon our experiences right from our childhood.
Yeah, so
And
our interest,
as per Srimad Bhagavatam, also each and every cell is also completely conscious. Its consciousness is a part of the cell, and it arises out of that Mahatattva, which is mentioned in the Srimad Bhagavatam, and that Mahatattva is our DNA, which is there in the nucleus. It's from the Vedic text that I have got insight to also substantiate the revelations that come in.
yes. So
Yeah.
our interest in our research, our studies, are dedicated toward trying to understand what is that harmony between science and religion. How can it be established? What do we have to think? What is the concept that's required to bring these two together and not have them only, completely opposite of one another without any connection whatsoever? So that's
Yeah.
the whole purpose of our institute is to study that relationship between the two, and to try to come up with those ideas that establish that relationship. We don't ignore the scientific point of view, but that point of view.
Please allow Dr. Puri to continue.
That's okay. That point of view, the religious point of view, is not entertained by science because they make a presupposition about the whole of which we are a part. Now that presupposition has never been justified. That's simply something they do out of the development of ideas over the centuries, coming from, like I said, Dr. Juarrero also mentioned this about how people have changed the idea of, let's say, Aristotle or Plato over the centuries, come down to what the modern scientific viewpoint is. But that has not always been entertained by civilization. And civilization, we cannot assume that the past civilizations were less intelligent than ourselves. They had reasons for the things they understood. And we have to try to discern that reasoning in our present day, even though things have changed so drastically. And that's what we're trying to do by study of the history of ideas and how they developed to the present state from the past. And if that can be understood, I think, and I have found that kind of resolution of the relationship between, say, religion and science in the philosophy of Hegel and the philosophers during the German idealistic period. And of course, we find that also in Vedanta and the Vedas. They never had a problem of conflict of science and religion as we do today, because their understanding was very different than what we have now. So
science believes in empirical data and observation using the sense organs, whereas what happens in meditation is revelations happen. Now, the other thing which I would like to say is in Srimad Bhagavatam, it is very clearly mentioned that everything rose out of consciousness, cosmic consciousness, right from a unicellular organism to a multicellular organism and the most complicated or the most evolved organism, which is the human. Everything evolved from the cosmic consciousness.
Now, so there's 15 minutes left designated for this dialogue. And I'm sure everyone is very busy, although it would be wonderful to just allow the dialogue to continue beyond that. But just for the sake of punctuality and to respect everyone's time, if I could possibly recommend one topic to discuss for the last 15 minutes that I think everyone would be able to say something about, I hope that would be okay. So essentially, from the angle of the development of modern science and starting to now embrace purposiveness and teleology, or this is the historic word, that gets us as far as systems thinking, right? Here we are with Dr. Denis Noble, a champion of systems biology, and with Dr. Juarrero, a champion of dynamic systems theory, right? And these allow us to have a more holistic vision of nature and describe the complexity of living cognitive entities in ways that far surpass the reductionist explanations. And that is a tremendous development beyond what science currently is. Well, but still we find in scientists who are embracing this systems thinking, such as Michael Levin from Boston, where he has written a paper just 2 years ago in Frontiers in Psychology, where he now, taking that systems approach, tries to define self, the computational boundaries of self as it relates to life and cognition. And using that systems approach, he is still limited from considering the first person perspective of self. He specifically says in that paper that he will only talk about third person perspectives. So the perspective of an observer viewing a self in nature, but he specifically mentions that he will not be talking about the first person perspective or the subjective sense of self that we all experience in every aspect of our life. So the idea of self-consciousness, our sense of self as self, and then our capacity to observe nature and for science to come out of our own self-consciousness and desire to have some idea of what we're doing and where we are, that still seems inaccessible through the systems approach. And again, I'm quoting Dr. Michael Levin's work here because he seems to be a very intelligent individual and doing a lot of good work in Boston. And he's utilizing the systems thinking, and he avoids the first person perspective. So he's not equipped with a conceptual framework to address that self-conscious first person perspective. So
I think part of that comes from the idea that science is supposed to make inferences about the universe from observation and some objective stance, and I think I'm kind of sympathetic with Levin's approach, because one thing about consciousness is that it's idiosyncratic. It is a subjective personal experience, and how is it that you approach a subjective personal experience through observation except through self-observation? We've heard from Anandi, for example, the powerful ways in which self-awareness can influence physiology and so forth, but it's very much a subjective personal experience, and that doesn't diminish it in any way. But how do you study something like that scientifically through observation of an experiment?
Well, the field of phenomenology is there. Phenomenology, Hegel used phenomenology to mean the science of the experience of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And so a scientific development, now again, as you mentioned yourself, science is philosophy, but it's philosophy of empirical observation, starting from empirical observation. So obviously philosophy can also be based on reason and necessity. And now obviously there are many philosophers who don't base their philosophy on that, but we should look to the ones who do, including Hegel. So his entire system starts from indeterminate being. Everything is in the sphere of logic. His philosophy goes from the sphere of logic to nature to spirit, where, as Dr. Puri said in his presentation, every determination moving the system forward is a negation, is narrowing down that universal, very broad, to more determinate until we arrive into the sphere of nature, of empirical observation, in which the conscious entity can look upon itself in the human form of life, which can't be done at any other form of life. The human can then ask questions about itself and about life. It's not just trying to survive, not just trying to eat, mate, sleep, etc.
Yeah.
And then
Well, I was just going to say, even though I say I'm sympathetic to Michael Levin's approach, that doesn't mean I agree with it. And actually, I think one of the problems with modern science is that it has deliberately limited itself to one particular way of approaching understanding the world, in such a way that it has come to imagine that it's the only scientific way to approach the world. And one of the reasons that the conference is so interesting is that we're actually exploring other ways that science can actually approach life, evolution, its nature, and so forth. And I'm not quite sure we're ready yet intellectually to take that on. There's been some progress made, obviously, but what's the path forward? I mean, Denis Noble has outlined one possible way to bring that in, to bring in these kinds of what might be considered nebulous concepts like mind into our thinking. But nevertheless, mind is absolutely essential. We have to find a way to actually make that happen. And
actually, in that spirit, I'd like to put a question to Brian Ford. You showed some really quite remarkable behavior by unicellular organisms. When watching those, I did not find it too difficult to imagine the experience of the organism itself. It seems to me that the one that was sending a pseudopodium out all over the place, exploring what was happening, must have had a sense of what it was doing and why it was doing it. It's very hard to imagine otherwise. But my question is this: is it correct to say that nearly all of those spectacular forms of behavior were actually eukaryotic? Or did you have any examples of prokaryotes doing anything comparable? That would begin to answer part of the point, wouldn't it?
Well, that's an interesting question, as all your questions always are, Denis, and it's a great pleasure to see you again. Some eukaryotes do, all eukaryotes do, and some prokaryotes do too. For example, if you look at bacteria, I mentioned in my talk, bacteria forming a biofilm, they do it by actually cooperating. They form a lattice, they line up together in an almost geometrical pattern. And so they are clearly aware of the benefits of acting together. And in my view, the one question we've been speaking greatly now about the ancient philosophers and modern philosophers too, those don't concern me. They're old and everybody else is talking about them. I talk about things nobody else is talking about. And from my point of view, what I find so interesting is the way in which the single-celled eukaryote became a multi-celled organism. And that, it was expressed in a book I had published almost 50 years ago, that is because of delegation. I think these complicated cells recognized in some strange way that they had done as much as they could. And by combining together into what we would now call an organism, so that some cells concentrated purely on excretion, other cells purely on fission, some cells purely on protection, others purely on digestion, then you began to have a multicellular organism in which each cell embodied a small selection of the propensities that existed in the original, more complicated cell. So in other words, multicellularity is a process of delegation, and more to the point, of recognizing that delegation would be beneficial. And what I find very interesting is this: the smallest organisms you can find. I mean, we did hear the point that epithelium is important. Epithelium is a latecomer. Epithelia only arise once you've got pretty substantive organisms. What I'm interested about is why an organism like, for example, Hydra would come together, because we don't have any organisms with fewer than, say, 1,000 cells. But when multicellularity began to evolve, it would have been 2, 3, 4, or 8 cells working in concert. And we have never come across such an organism. We have no knowledge of what they might be. But in my scheme of things, in the terms of a sort of a spectrum of delegation, then they must at one stage have organized themselves. I mean, it could well be that if you think of the biofilm, that cells would have come together in a clump, and some would have just found it was more convenient to concentrate on a specific physiological or metabolic function, and others on something else. And in time, multicellularity would have evolved. Very little attention has ever been paid by any biological philosopher to how a single-celled organism becomes a multi-celled organism. And I've got a sneaky feeling that my diagram that was published in 1976 is the only possible explanation that anybody has ever yet put forward. The questions that I like to address are those that nobody else is considering. I'm not greatly concerned with matters which already have thousands of devoted philosophers dissecting and digesting.
But I think the question that you've raised is extremely important. When does a clump transition to an organized collection? That's the key.
That's a very good point. And when you look at these biofilms,
that's the issue here.
The biofilm could almost be a multicellular organism.
I have that as a footnote in the second book. Biofilms seem to be an in-between, between a lattice that seem to sort of stack on top of each other. When does it? Yes. When is the stack not a clump, but it becomes organized into a hierarchical or hierarchical organization of some sort? And the question
by the way,
what's the causation there?
By the way, about your metronomes, that isn't quite right. The metronomes have got to be identical. They've got to be tuned to the same time, and they've got to be started differently, and they must be on a flexible shelf. If they're on a piece of granite, it won't work. They have to be on a shelf that can just subtly and imperceptibly move And in that way, that resonance is transmitted, and eventually they become as synchronized as women in a group synchronizing their menstrual periods. It is a remarkable thing.
Correct. It's the same thing. Exactly.
Can I make one point, please?
Before we continue, which we will, for those who would like to stay and continue the discussion will remain. For those who need to go, we understand, and we want to, offer our sincere gratitude for you taking the day to join us to follow these variegated talks from very different angles of vision, and to still gather with nothing that could be short of sincere humility from all the participants to have this kind of amicable discussion. And we thank you very much, and we hope that this has been productive for philosophy, for science, for just opening us up to new perspectives in some way. And please feel free to leave if you need to. Otherwise, we will remain here. So,
thank you very much for inviting me. I have to go to a grandchild's birthday party.
Yes, I have to go too, but I think I can speak for everyone that we echo your thanks and your appreciation for the contributions of everyone here. I thought it was a fascinating day.
Yes, it really was. I also have to go, but my thoughts will remain.
Thank you, Dr.
Okay.
Ford. Pleasure to see you again.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Take care.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.